Okay, we are now recording. Hello, head count. Before we really get started with part two, I want to do like a little mini review of part one relatively quickly. First off, I want to acknowledge that most of the time that I ever went to an online diversity training, it was all four of these parts, like skipping rocks. So, kind of sort of learning about things, possibly reflecting on things, and then the hour was up. So, I warned you at the beginning that this is not skipping rocks, that this is super deep. I also, by design, just want you to kind of like acknowledge your own experience, right? Some of you, like Ace was sharing at the end, like they majored in this. So this is like, yep, it's a Wednesday. Anybody need help? What's going on? So there's a possibility as we move forward that there will be things that either someone who's very familiar with this learn, of course, that's always option, and two, how to work with people who are newer to the conversation. Sometimes there's another tech company client that talk about the knowledge privilege, which I've never heard of that term before, but the way that they use it is you don't know what it was like before you knew what you know, right? So then you just kind of assume that everybody knows what you know, but like at some point in time, you didn't know this either. So those of you, which is a lot of you that are familiar or pretty embedded in these kind of terms and these kind of conversations, etc., please use this as a reminder that not everybody is, and not even just on your team, but like your family members and people on social media, random people you're going to bump into at some point. So it's like it's a good place for that. For those of you that are newer to the conversation, please know that there's not a test, and this is a study as you go program. And the bonus is that I actually feel you're at an advantage, especially with everything that's up right now within your organization. You might be at an advantage at being relatively new to this conversation, or at least feeling like, wow, that was a lot, that was very fast, what's happening? Because by being in that position, you're able to actually see and participate in a conversation in a way that's not burdened by what you think you already knew. The quick example that I like to use there, when I was in the Peace Corps, again, of course, liberal white woman, of course, I served in the Peace Corps. But I was a secondary education major in college, and I went to school in Arkansas and taught full time at Little Rock Central before I graduated from college. So when I show up in Bulgaria, I already have a year of teaching under my belt. I'm like, ready to go. And then I got there and I found out that everything that they do in education is completely different. The culture is completely different. What we call cheating, they call collaboration. The whole cohort and the whole class gets one grade. So there's not individual competition. And it was the hardest part of that was unlearning everything that I knew and that I had known and that I had done to then begin to teach inside of their system. So just know that when we start talking about self-reflection, this is not for sport. And so this really is like for your own use as you wish when you wish, right? So you're nailing it, I promise. But if you have questions or comments or something, I am available and happy to help. And I did actually text with a number of y'all over the weekend, which was very exciting for me. So feel free. You're doing a great job. So to kind of review, are all of you familiar with, and those of you that aren't on video, which is totally fine, I just don't know what kind of device you're calling in, so it might be harder from a phone, and the iPad does not have to participate. But if you are familiar with how to rename your square, so the square with your face in it, we're usually just narcissistic enough to know exactly where the square with our face is. So the top right corner, I think I mirrored. So the top right corner is three little dots, and you should be able to rename your square. So what I'm going to ask you to do in kind of a review of part one is to rename your square one of your invisible dominant identities. So some of you are like, damn, I didn't know there was a quiz. So remember, there's visible and invisible. So invisible means it's true to you, but other people don't just necessarily automatically know it. If you're on a mobile, You're also welcome to, oh, there's directions. Good job. Click on your name and rename. And if you're like, I don't like this technology business, you can just put it into chat. But what I want you to do is to rename your square, ideally, one of your invisible dominant identities. So something that people can't necessarily perceive or tell about you, that is also highly privileged. Okay. Are we ready? Are we doing it? Good. So we have registered voter, US citizen. Any others? College graduate, straight. Oh, y'all are nailing this. Good job.
I'm sorry for being the idiot. How do I change it? Where do I go? I
Don't
see
worry.
speaker view in a box, enter full screen on the right. Those aren't it, right?
I was going to make a joke about how do you change your invisible dominant identity, and I'm like, well, choose how to be, but you mean how to rename. Are you
Yep.
calling in from your outdoors? So you're probably calling in from some kind of device.
Yeah, I'm on a laptop.
Oh, you're on a laptop. That's
Yeah.
even easier. So
Yeah.
if you, the square with your face on it, the
Yeah.
top right corner.
Ah, the top right corner of that. I'm sorry.
No, no,
Okay,
no,
I
you're
got it.
good.
I got it. Okay.
Zoom coaching, here to go.
Yep.
Okay, so as you're are changing or renaming your thing, breadwinner husband. Oh, I'm very excited. What does that even mean? I have,
It means I work because I really love my work, but I don't work to pay for my family.
I went straight to like sourdough. Okay, never mind. I have successfully killed 3 sourdough starters, by the way, just so you know. Evidently
I'm
mold.
actually gluten free, so there's no bread in my life.
Gotcha. Got ya. All right, good to know. Good to know. You should come here because I'm trying and it's not working out really well. Okay. Bachelor's degree is a good one. Small business owner, me too. Good job. Child of teachers, good job. Graduate degree, super good. Okay, great. So now here's what's interesting about invisible dominant identities. So, like, one of them is education access, which some of y'all alluded to. Sometimes you don't necessarily know that you have more or less education than the person that you are interacting with until it becomes painfully obvious. And when it becomes painfully obvious, so I just enrolled in an MBA program, right? So I'm supposed to be in a study group with folks who are 30 years younger than me. And they're like, hold on, I have to like brush up on a few things. And I was like, what are you brushing up on? What secret brush do you have? What is happening? So the conversation about effective rate is completely lost on me because I'm trying to remember, do you do multiplication first or do you do arithmetic first? How does that work? What's happening? Right? So like, but I have a master's degree. So I'm not used to not being like academically successful, but I'm more importantly not used to being academically challenged in a way that I'm not comfortable with. So welcome back, Jess, to being a student. So that's important to remember, right? Then another piece is when I was at the UPS store prior to COVID-19, obviously, and there was a person who was filling out a form, and you're standing in line, you can kind of tell like they were getting frustrated, etc. And they were handed this form that they had to fill out in order to ship a package back. So I'm watching, and I realize I don't. This is a FedEx delivery person filling out a FedEx form, and I don't think that they knew how to fill out the form. So I just asked, do you need any help with that form? And they were like, no, 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 totally got it. And I was like, okay, totally cool. And I stood back in line. And then I was like, if you decide you do need help, I'm totally happy to help. I have nothing going on with my day. So eventually he whispered under his breath, he's like, I don't know how to read. And I was like, fantastic, can't wait. Turns out he's like the manager of the FedEx shipping warehouse, right? But he doesn't know how to read, so he can't fill out the form. So there's nothing wrong with that. There's not a judgment value in that, but are you available for those kind of realities? Okay, one more. We're going to do renaming. So now I want you to do a visible. Didn't we did invisible before? Yes, registered voter. Okay, so I want you to do a visible subordinated identity. So one that has less privilege based on other people in the universe, a visible subordinated identity. Here's the bonus: if you have one, You may not even have one. It's possible. So this is, you do not, there's no guarantee. So visible subordinated identity.
Can you give any examples of what one? I mean, I'm struggling here with
Yeah, totally knock
subordinate.
yourself out. So homeowner is a fantastic one, by the way, for the other one. Good job. So you're nailing it. You can still struggle and nail it. Well, welcome to my cooking skills, right? So when I say visible subordinated identity, my example is obese, and by that I mean curvy, right? So what is interesting, I think, is often when we think about our subordinated identities, there comes with some, it often comes with some kind of, for lack of better words, like sass, because you have figured out how to navigate the world with this, right? It is subordinated by other people, not necessarily by you. And it might be something that you're very proud of or that you have a rich connection to, even though the system we're kind of walking around says, no, that's the lower group in some fake system that we live by. So I don't know you at obviously at all. So if it was a visible subordinated group, what if by chance I'm making this up? Is this Tim? Is that correct? Because now you're labeled homeowner. Do I remember that? Yes. Okay. So what if you are one of those proud vegan people? Right. So there's probably one on this call, statistically speaking, right? Oh, hi. Thank you, woman identified person. Good job. Proud vegans. So proud vegans are not, it's not very easy to just walk around and like go get food. You have to like think about it, etc. And then I think much like coming out as not a straight person, there's a pride stage of vegan. Is I my friends, at least, as soon as they find chocolate and some kind of thing that resembles cheese that works in what their dietary choices, they're on board. Sounds great. Let's do it. So there, the pride stage may also happen, and then there's also the ongoing jokes that us non-vegan people use about how vegans can't like go to the dentist without talking about being a vegan. So that's all kind of part of this, right? So if you have, and it is possible you may not have anything, right? So tattoo collector is a really great example. Good job, nailed it. So it is obviously visible depending on what clothing you are wearing, and we still live in a society where that's not always identified as quote unquote professional. And we could do a whole workshop on who gets to determine what is professional. Ding, ding, ding. People who look like me. Okay. So, any other ones that we got going on? So, Asian, femme presenting, female identity, woman identified, unkept perpetually. That goes back to being professional or not professional, right? Uh, Guy with long hair, a mom, black, right? So what's important to know specifically about naming race, and I think that's Shannon. Is that correct? Now everyone's changed their name. I'm winning. Okay, so what's interesting is that for some folks, coming up with a visible one is hard, and often that is because we are white. So we can't choose white. So now, okay, so now what are we going to do? What's happening? What's going on? Which is why I word them the way that I do. So those of you that don't identify as white, you're like, how about this one, right? So, and because how white supremacy works is race other than white is almost always first. And so it's a very fascinating process to try and engage with folks without race being the very first check. And that also can be a really marginalizing, silencing thing. So again, this is, I'm noticing over the weekend, so many Karens on my Facebook page saying, well, why can't we all just be colorblind? And you can't be colorblind because you only have to pick and choose when to incite your colorblindness. So understanding these dynamics is very, very important. So thoughts or comments about that? And then we have one more, and then we'll get started with the number 2 webinars. Good comments, ideas? Short is also a really good one. Okay, great. So now last one is when I mentioned in the last one some about being either masculine, feminine, man or woman. We talked a little bit male or female. No, I also introduced either cisgender privilege where things are congruent, or I also mentioned gender nonconforming. And so sometimes this will come up with pronoun usage. So what is interesting is that when asked, this gets back to education privilege too. When asked, well, what are your pronouns or what are your preferred pronouns? And there's politics over which one is the best one to do. But if I say, what pronouns do you use? Sometimes what happens is, oh shit, what is a pronoun? So I wasn't expecting a grammar pop quiz today. I don't know that I'm dressed for this. What's a pronoun? So then it's usually a good practice for you to kind of lead the way. So I didn't do this last time, but my name's Jess Pettit and I use she, her, hers, or feminine pronouns. So then some people are like, okay, great, I don't know, what does that still mean? So another practice that is starting to happen on Zooms is that you can say in your rename, she, her, hers with plurals, rename. So then it'll show up in my little square. So that if you want to rename yourself as your name that you want me to call you, you can get creative here, but just know I will call you that name. And the pronouns that you use, then everyone on the call automatically knows. But it is also like a reminder when you start engaging with that person, because when they speak, their little box gets bigger or it highlights green, etc. And if you provide the pronouns that you use, then it becomes a lot easier for folks who don't have to be the first people to do that. So as a facilitator, a bad move is having everybody in a circle, everybody says their name until you get to the person that people quote can't tell. And then you're like, wait, what are your pronouns? Okay, and then you keep going. That's just awkward and strange, and it's part of privilege, right? Is that very few people use any other pronoun for me other than she, her, hers, because of how they perceive me, how I sound on the phone, my name, and bonus round, I use she, her, hers pronouns, so that just works out super dupes, right? But not everybody has that experience, so you can make it a little bit more comfortable for everyone who may be using the space that you know about, as well as people that you don't know about, right? So if you want to update those, that would be great. And then as we proceed, whenever you chat in the chat box or something, it'll be labeled how you label yourself. So even outside of Zooms with me, I'd recommend this just as kind of habit and practice, not just for internal use, but like, what if you have another guest visitor? They don't know anybody. And that was actually one of the interesting things about like this particular gig is that it all happened so quickly. I didn't get anybody's names, anybody's jobs, anybody's pronouns, where people live. I didn't know anything, right? And we're already like a webinar and a debrief activity in. And so I try to like go with it. So I tried really hard last time to use they, them pronouns for every single person I was talking about because I just didn't know. So one of the best things that came out of Texas, high five Texas, is y'all. Y'all is gender neutral plural word. We get like one thing right, okay? So then if you say y'all and they, them, then that can happen. Now back to education access, and then we'll get started today, is that there's usually a grammarist that shows up that's like, excuse me, that's not appropriate because they, them is a plural word, and let me explain to you what happens. So first off, they, them can be a plural word, and it can also be an individual word. For example, while I'm on this webinar, FedEx is coming to pick up my replacement kitchen aid because I'm trying to bake and it broke. So they will be showing up, which means my dogs will be going apeshit crazy at some point in time. So they is not the entire FedEx company. They is the person I don't know who's driving the truck who's going to pick a box up off my ping pong table. Yes, I have a ping pong table. I'm married to an adult. So that is an important thing. We use they, them as singular when we don't know, but we get grammarist when we think we know, and then we start assigning stuff to them. See, I just did it again. Not to mention William Shakespeare used they, them as singular pronouns, and evidently white successful authors have a lot of power in our society. If he did it and didn't hurt his writing career, you can probably do it too. So that is my little review from last time. Thoughts, comments, questions? It's a very engaged, interactive group. Oh, what is yins? Jamie, I don't even know that one. Can you unmute just to say it so I know how to say it?
Yeah, you said it right. It's in Pittsburgh. There's a way that Pittsburghers talk, and we say, "Yin's guy's going down there to the pants and that and get some new pants." It's the accent the Pittsburghers have, and they call each other yins. Yins guys.
Nice. It makes
Yeah.
me think of Utes
It,
from my cousin Benny.
yeah,
Which
from my cousin Penny.
I never heard anybody ever actually say Utes, but it could be a thing. Okay. Are we ready for unconscious bias, perceptions of self and others? Okay, great. 2 people are. Everybody else, buckle up. Okay, I should be successfully sharing my screen. Is the world cooperating with me right now? Looks like it. Great. Okay, let me move all my little pop-up boobops in case you chat or something. Okay, so thank you for dealing with my technical difficulties. So as promised, this is my version of a defensive driving class for specific diversity issues. So when people will say, well, Jessica, can you just keep it simple? Like we've got a lot of shit to do. Can you just like fix all of our diversity problems just real quick? Because we have to get back to this budget meeting or something. So no, and that's why I kept dragging my feet to do this, because I don't think that it's a very quick conversation. And I think there needs to be just enough rub, and there needs to be just enough like, oh yeah, I get it, in order for people to really engage with both of these pieces. So as we're moving along, I want you to constantly be thinking about, conveniently, we almost always just default to a binary. So if you need to, try it out. But this binary is dominant and subordinated, dominant and subordinated. So oftentimes when we start talking about intentions, we're coming from a dominant place. When we start talking about impact, we're often coming from a subordinated place, even if the conversation isn't coming from one of those matching identities. So I just need you to kind of like play I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember Pong, not beer pong, different, but it's a little green dot, and this is what captivated us for hours after school. So I just need you to play Pong with the ideas of subordinated and dominant as we go through. So I created the second workshop really to work on building the muscle of doing this. Some people immediately jump to empathy when we start talking about unconscious bias, but I think it's important is that conscious bias and unconscious bias can be positive and negative. You can be aware of it, you can not be aware of it. And it is my opinion that you are responsible for becoming slightly more aware of the things that you are not aware of. Again, low bar, very low bar. We're taking them one at a time. So if that, again, the texting number is 202-670-4262. And those that I was texting with over the weekend, please feel free. There's not like a limit or something. You're allowed to text as much as you want. Happy to help. So do you remember this? This is a visual slide specifically of a Facebook meme that went around about a dress and what color the dress is, which is not helpful if you're colorblind. But what was fascinating to me is that this was actually a sociological study. It is the same photograph of a dress with a different filter on it. And people became gold dress team and blue dress team to the death. I don't actually think in reality to the death, but it was pretty close in the office spaces that I was working in. Then a couple of years later, it doesn't seem like it was a couple years, but it was a couple years later, was Yanny and Laurel, the audio file that you had to listen to. And again, people were like, no, what is wrong with you? Okay, so we remember these things, but we don't know that the scientists studying behind it set it up to be random, set it up to be confirmation bias. So once you've listened to your thing, say Yanny 1,000 times, and you listen to someone else's and theirs says Laurel, you will hear Yanny because it's confirmation bias. And that audio file is actually set up every once in a while to play the other word just to drive people nuts. And it worked. But what's important to understand about this is that we questioned each other more than we questioned the activity or the scientist or the study or the Facebook poster. If we can actually control for who it is we default listen to, instead we can actually just engage in a conversation, we'll be able to have more productive conversations. But we don't always do that. So I just wanted to use this as an example of sometimes things are by design, sometimes you are the conscious designer of it. Sometimes you are the unconscious designer of it. Sometimes you are the conscious benefactor, and sometimes you're the unconscious benefactor. But this is the system that we need to get to in order to understand positive and negative, conscious and unconscious bias. Cool? That is the plan for the day. So, what do you see in this photograph? You're welcome to use the chat, or you can unmute if you need to verbalize it. But what do you see? What's the story that you write? What do you fill in here? What would happen if you're wrong with the story that you write in this picture? You're welcome to chat or unmute and talk. Somebody needs sunscreen. It's very true.
Okay, I'll talk because I'm an extrovert and I don't like quiet.
And you've been taking a lot of hits because of the vegan business.
Always. So my immediate, what I see, and the story that my mind creates is it's a gentleman, someone who is male presenting or male identifying. They were in war, so obviously I made them a veteran. They lost their leg, probably like below their knee, and they went to travel after all of that. And some reason my brain is like, they're in Ireland. The more I look at it, they're not in Ireland because I'm like, that looks like volcanic rock maybe or whatever. But that's just where my brain went.
Great. So, what an amazing example of how complete a story one can write. Right now, bonus, you are correct about some of the things. You are not correct about some of the things. And you don't always get the opportunity to be fact checked, right? So we just navigate with the stories that we roll with. So I will tell you, this is my brother-in-law. 2 points. We are in Ireland. And he lives in Ireland, the west coast of Ireland. And every time we go and visit, he's like my favorite family member that came with the package. So amazing. Every single time we go, within the first hour or two that we are together, I have some internal panic because he seems to be missing a leg. Now, fun facts, he was last time too. And I don't know why this file will not stay permanently updated. And it's different things. Sometimes it's a walk. Sometimes it's actually like waking up early enough to like see him before he's put his leg back on, his prosthetic back on. But most of the time, it is the drape of his pants. It's subtle. It's under the table. He's driving a car, and I will go into full on, completely calm shit house freak attack because I've obviously left his leg somewhere. Now, notice the story that I write is I'm in charge of this mistake, and I feel like I have to fix this mistake immediately. When the fixing is me just consistently updating the story that I write about my brother, right? Brother-in-law. So it is very important to know you're responsible for the story. You're responsible for the editing of the story. You're also responsible for noticing, oh shit, I forgot to edit that again. That's it. So for me, when we started talking about worldview, Jessica Simpson has played a dramatic role in my life. So I'm going to use a little self-disclosure here. So first off, my name is Jessica, and growing up Jessica in Texas meant I instantly knew everything that was happening with Jessica McClure and Jessica Lang, and then Jessica Simpson came, so of course we're best friends, or just have a similar name. So when Jessica Simpson was in the movie The Dukes of Hazzard, which some of you may or may not have watched, I would not add it to your Netflix list, but maybe you watched it. So she lost all this weight, worked out a whole bunch, and was this super skinny version in order to be Daisy Duke. And then the movie came out, and fairly soon after the movie came out, she was performing a concert. So great. We live in the United States, which is basically here to eat people who have gained weight. So, and I use that word on purpose. So for me, as a larger person who is the smallest person in my family, everyone else was like over 6 feet tall and size zeros, etc. And then, hi, recessive genes showed up. That was particularly powerful for me that this particular image always being brought up, and people would actually like slip pictures of her and things like this. Have you seen the movie yet? Like, this is weight loss motivation for me. So what's fascinating is that the picture of her that we first saw, the one that was on the right, is what was actually posted in the media afterwards. The picture in the middle is the real picture that has not been altered at all. She is still quite rail thin, in my opinion, but the picture that we showed in media and that we then consumed was her gaining all of this weight after the movie. Now, she reports when making the movie, she was the unhealthiest she had ever been in order to be that shape and size, in order to be in the movie. So we go one step further. She's dating Tony Roma. For those of you that don't do the sports ball, that is a football player. And she breaks up with him for McDonald's. And notice again the size that she's being depicted as. This is all because she was unhealthy in the first place to be in a movie. I say that because there is an invisible framework of what I, as a woman, have been told I am supposed to look like. There is an invisible framework of what I'm supposed to look like. And then I have also created almost an invisible framework like chicken wire that is a story about my weight and my health and how I look and how I don't look. That this is the sassy piece I was referring to that has become like a survival mechanism. So what I want you to be noticing is that the systems that you're navigating, if you kind of have no idea what I'm talking about yet, you're probably navigating it just fine. And if you're like, oh yeah, I've bumped up against that rail, then part of that is noticing where your subordinated or marginalized identities come in. When we use the words marginalized and silenced, it really is kind of an electrified framework, and it'll hurt when you are actually kind of pushing those boundaries. And I mean that hurt metaphorically. I also mean that very realistically and physically. There's physical pain that can be involved as well, shifting and changing the invisible framework. Now, what's fascinating is culture, when we start talking about our cultural norms or professionalism that we alluded to at the beginning, there's kind of an evolution of what is expected. And like tire tracks in the desert, though, that evolution is not easy to follow. So the culture is kind of this moving target that you're just experiencing in the moment, and it either is or isn't going well. And you don't always necessarily know. And how that is challenged will depend on what is going well or not going well in the future. And then we kind of look back like, oh yeah, that was weird, right? So like the example that I like to use is, let's say, masculine professionalism or masculine power. Dun, 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 dun. If I was talking about George W. and George W. rolls into a meeting in heels and stockings and lace and silk and makeup, if I was talking about George Washington at the time, that is actually how a white masculine president of the United States exhibited power, right? Now, part of that is related to slavery and trade and global domination and classism, but whatever. That was how you like dressed up for work to show how powerful you were. If I fast forward and I start talking about George W. Bush, showing up to work that way might have done something for his approval ratings, but that's no longer how masculine US white presidents show power. It's very different. So then when you get to Obama, that's when like a khaki suit is critiqued, or like whether he did or did not have a flag pin is critiqued, because he was in the uniform of the time, but the person in the uniform was different. Ironically, Hillary Clinton got dinged all the time for wearing pantsuits, which is the uniform, but now there was a woman in it, right? So just notice just the framework of what US leader person is supposed to look like, how that is being critiqued. And for the record, us pinko commie liberals, we are not exempt. So how a first lady is supposed to behave, how the president is supposed to behave, how long your tie is supposed to be, etc. Like we are now doing that to both Melania and Donald Trump too. But the rules aren't written anywhere. You're just held accountable to them. And most people in power don't even know what the rules are. They just know what's right. So back to Peace Corps days, when my students would ask, what's the English rule? Why would you say it that way instead of this way? I didn't know what the rule is. I just knew what's right. I knew it because it just sounds right. And they'd be like, right, but like I'm trying to study here. So like, when does the I come before the E? Yeah, good luck. But that's not how you spell that word, right? Like that's privilege. That's understanding the system, but I'm unconscious of the system that I understand, but I'm totally navigating it relatively successfully. That's the dynamic that I want us to focus on. Joe Gerdstan is one of my favorite people on the planet. And this is a quote that I think is quite important. So first time I saw this, I took a screenshot of it and it was the background of my phone for a very, very long period of time. I would encourage you to do the same. You're not responsible for your first thought. That's the subconscious kind of piece of where culture has sunk in. But don't stop there. You are responsible for your second thought and what your first action is going to be. And it's the gap between the first thought and what your first action is going to be. That's where your power lies, and that's where your responsibility is in between that gap. So I like to bring up an optical illusion. For this particular image, you're welcome to use the chat if you like, but what do you see? Do you see a duck or do you see a bunny? Welcome to use the little chatty function. Duck, 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 goose. Ha. Some people see both. Some people see the duck and then they see the bunny. Some people saw the bunny first. Great, both. Okay, for those of you that can't see both, I just want you to notice that, again, this is another example of where the artist drew this so that it is hidden inside both a duck and a bunny. This was on purpose. So similar to Laurel and Yanny, you can be team duck and you can be team bunny, and there's a lot of pride in team both. But what I want you to acknowledge is that when you flip, keep looking at the image. So to use words with this, the duck bill becomes the bunny ears. The eye stays roughly the same. And it's just whether the bunny is facing left and the duck is facing right. Make sense? So when you flip back and forth, for some, me included, even though I do this webinar all the time, I can feel a switch happen. That is kind of this muscle that I'm trying to get us to practice, is between what we automatically see and then we have to think about seeing the other one. Those of you that saw both, there's a very good chance you see both because you've seen this before. This is like a very, very famous optical illusion. What we have to do is be responsible for our first thoughts. Control, Alt, delete them and see what our second thoughts are. It is possible our second thoughts will align with our first thoughts, but at least we're conscious of them. Do you see what I'm saying here? The rabbit duck scenario isn't about right and wrong. It's about an artist deciding this would be. Now you get to determine what it is you see and how are you going to actually see the other side. More so than ever, I feel like I have typed this a gazillion times to people on the Facey books because I'm coming for my cousins, but it does not have to be a problem for you in order for it to be a problem that exists. It's a very important thing to understand. It does not have to be a problem for you in order for that problem to exist. Long lines are not something I have to deal with right now because I'm sheltering in place. This bias shows up constantly. So these are images from actual AP published news media things, and I'm not going to dog on all media. I just want you to use it as an example. This is in response to Hurricane Katrina. Both of these stories were roughly 4 hours apart, I believe. One of them is what I would say is a young black kid, I'm guessing a kid, who is, according to the article, looting a grocery store. Now we are talking about at the bottom to what look to be maybe adult white people. Notice the age thing too. One is a kid, one is adults. How do I know this? I don't know, but my story gets written, and they are finding bread. Just found it floating in the floodwaters. So the bias is important. So again, I mentioned this in the first one, when we talk about the protests that are happening right now in the streets, what is fascinating to me is that most of the dominant, privileged white folks that I'm talking to about the protests that are happening, they know that it is connected to violence, but they center the concept of violence around something they are more comfortable talking about. So instead of the violence being police brutality, the violence is the looting. And so then they conflate it together. They feel like they're talking about the same thing, but they've centered it in the wrong place because it keeps me out of the problem. But no, we have to dive in. We are all part of the same structure, the same culture, the same invisible framework. So we have to be responsible for the impact of what these differences do to people represented in the photographs, but as well as what these do as confirmation bias of the story that we wrote. When Katrina wrote the story about my brother-in-law, she was totally right about a veteran, but that's not where he lost his leg, and Ireland. He lost his leg in a boating accident long after he retired, right? Who knew? It's important to be able to leave that space, but to notice your own patterning of stories. So I wrote a book called Notice Notes that are all different conversation starters. So one of them is relevant to a grocery store. Grocery stores happen to be something that I love more than anything. When I used to travel, I go in, you can learn everything about the local community, about the local grocery store. What's on the end caps? What are they selling of? How are they putting accessories with something else or condiments with something else, right? Like I had no idea that people eat hot dogs a million different ways. There's my way of eating a hot dog and all the others are wrong, right? I also didn't know neon electric green relish exists. That's the only form of pickle I don't want to eat because I don't know what that color is. So I'm walking around the grocery store aisle when I'm in my 30s probably when this happened, and I realized the ethnic food aisle where I go and buy things for recipes and stuff like this. But if this is the ethnic food aisle, what is everything else in the store? And just something as subtle as that, which is, it's not fascinating to me that racism happens. It's fascinating to me that it took me 30 something years to even like think about this. Like it's an amazing process of how embedded I am in a system I am not conscious of. So just noticing those and beginning to have the conversations of how you react and how you respond is really important. And I keep talking about responsibility, so this is another thing that I have kept up forever. But when we are waiting for someone else to be responsible, when we talk about leadership or supervision or management or just like navigating a co-community, it's important to understand that we can displace responsibility for ourselves very easily. But the trick is that it's just going to come right back to us because we're all experiencing this. You can't actually displace your responsibility. You can just distance yourself from feeling responsible, which is not always a great move. Okay, so this leads me to, for those of you that were on their very first kind of pivot call, I briefly introduced a model that I came up with that I think is helpful when we start talking about our own bias, but also how we respond. So the gap between the first thought, the second thought, and our action. So I'm going to assume that I can't really do very much about first thoughts because that's where you're coming from, right? But I can try to educate between first and action so that there is a second thought, right? That will then inform the action. Sometimes we immediately go to action and like we're responsible for that. Sometimes we immediately go to inaction and we're responsible for that. But it's the second thought that I think is important, right? So if I remember correctly, I think it was Kellen on the very first call that we were talking about gathering information and just like, if I think I am right, feeling kind of paralyzed and not really knowing what to do, etc. But that is also an action, right? So not doing something is just as much of an action as doing something. So my model is head, heart, action. Head means very specific details. Heart in this case does not mean emotions. Evidently emotions are appropriate, so they're head and details. In this case, heart means big ideas, connected to big ideas. And then the action is the doing or the not doing of a something. So I came up with this, but to avoid my own burnout. And I'm going to use public art as the example. So this is near Dolores Park in San Francisco. And we were on a walk. It was gorgeous and it was beautiful. And what is fascinating is heady people like myself, we might immediately look at this and wonder about permits or property values, or for graffiti, the first thing I do is spell check it, right? Like, I'm not fun. People don't invite me to parties because I immediately go super, super detailed and start asking about these things that are like, yes, but is those flowers are not indigenous to this area. I really wish you had chosen flowers that were more specific to the Northern California. Like, do you see what I'm saying? That details can be very buzzkilly, but it is what they are. Can someone let Brittany in because my mouse is being bizarre, and amplify them to co-host? Welcome, Brittany. So if a heady person kind of defaults to these very detailed pieces, when we see public art, we don't necessarily go to kind of the impact or how it was done or what's going on. We go to why was it done? Is it for the good? Is it for the bad? Are they supposed to be doing it? Who said structures? Who gave them permission to do this? Whether we know it or not, that is usually somewhere informed in our immediate responses. Now, hardy folks, I think is important, is this mural was actually being painted while we were there. So I actually got to take all these photographs with permission. Heady people are like, who's that guy? What's going on? Does she have permission to do this? So what's fascinating is that hardy folks may very well see the creativity of an artist, may see the impact that this giant mural has on the community, whether it be good or bad. In this particular case, I think a hardy person would actually interpret this as beautification of a neighborhood, and also how Dolores Park is being gentrified into the beautification of a certain class and a certain culture of people. That could instantly be a hardy response. You see this giant mural, we're walking down the street, I'm like, I wonder if that's permitted. And the other person is like, gentrification is real. Do you see how that looks like miscommunication? But the reality is, it's not miscommunication. It's the same conversation. We're actually on the same topic. We're just having very different responses. So the first thought is kind of embedded in us. I can't do much about it. But the second thought and the action, that's where something can happen. So often we think we are miscommunicating because we're just actually having different second thoughts or different response actions to the same topic. But that's actually communicating. It's just a different facet of the conversation. So then back to the mural, action oriented people, you're kind of like, I don't care about gentrification or permits. How did that happen? Was it at night? Were there drones? Was it one person? What's going on? Action people are very excited that I got pictures of this like hydraulic lift situation because it helps them actually figure out how it was done. Because people who have a higher action level, it's really the verbs of things that get people very excited. At high level action people, especially with volunteers, we almost always burn them out because we make them first sit through orientation meetings. Sometimes we even give them a binder. They are not there for the binder. The heady people are all over the binder and finding all of the edits, right? And the hardy people probably really like the orientation meetings because they get to meet everybody else. It is important to know that we default, our life has taught us a way to be safe and prepared. And we typically show up with two of those variables. So if we're going to have a really dynamic team, we actually need people who are of a mixture of these variables, not just hiring only people exactly like us, because then it's really hard to get anything done because we actually don't even know how to have a conversation because we're just kind of like, yeah, right? So this is not more pictures for the action-oriented people. He had lots of spray pan, Kate, etc. Okay, great. So if this is the broader picture of the mural, it's going to take both head, heart, and action in order to actually do something full. And the language that I use is unstoppable. So oftentimes when someone is starting an initiative, so Andy, you and I have not talked about this, but I'm just going to guess that somewhere, someday you had an idea for an organization. And chances are what you ended up figuring out was how to use all three variables. And then that's what made you unstoppable. So any of you can have an idea and you're kind of like, I don't really know. And then something clicks and all of a sudden you like can't stop. You're just doing the thing, whatever the thing is. That's the moment where all three variables are being used for good. All three variables are in us all the time, but often we use two as a survival mechanism. And then the other one is where like fraud and imposter syndrome and like, well, I don't really know what to do, and paralysis and like, well, I don't know, maybe I should read another book. Like that's where this comes in. So what's also fascinating over the weekend, dealing with my social media folks, is a lot of my little white friends are very excited that they're reading Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility book. Very excited, posting photographs. They're very, look at me, I'm a good white person. I bought a book. Great. So notice that that's an action. They bought a book and they're reading it. Great. Most of the responses are, first off, that book is better than not reading any book, and I would like to have a critical conversation with you about the book once you read it. So then the pushback is, wait, I thought if I read this book, I wouldn't have any more work to do. Oh, no, you have to read the book. Now we have to have a conversation about how it's actually also patting you on the back for reading the book in the first place. And because it's written by a white woman, what does that mean? Now let's debunk whiteness and womanness. My friends are not here for it. They're just very proud that they read the book. Okay, fine. You read the book. That is not a miscommunication either, because it's actually on the same subject. But I have to navigate what makes them feel safe and prepared while they are also doing something that they think is risky and dangerous, which is sitting on a couch reading a book about a topic they haven't read about. So in order to really engage with them, I need to kind of like cross into that space. But ideally, some of them are also crossing into this space to then have a more rigorous conversation about that. And now here's the next book. Make sense? This is just communication, but until we really understand what we're conscious of and what we're unconscious of, or at least slightly more conscious of what we are unconscious of, we can't move forward. So the model of head, heart, and action for me, is an important model that I use in my work because it's not as defensive making, and it's also not as education based. So there's a lot of vocabulary words and stuff that are happening that some people have had access to, some people haven't. So this is pretty much Wizard of Oz level standard, right? Head, heart, and action. It's not Wizard of Oz though, because the heart is not emotions. I am not comfortable being a Tin Man yet, doing my own work. But if we can have a conversation in a heady, hearty, and action-oriented way, it's pulled back enough that I have found that I can actually have real conversations with folks. Now, the gas pedal, that's what I'm talking about when you actually line up with the three. Your third, whichever one is the one you don't use very much, the third one slows you down and accelerates you depending on where you're at. For those of you that are like super nerdy and would really like to do a survey, you can go to goodenoughnow.com/survey. It's 13 questions that involve like taco trucks and Dolly Parton, but it is statistically viable because I'm a nerd. And it'll kind of diagnose you based on how you answer those questions in response. Heady people, you're the ones that are probably the most annoyed by the survey because it doesn't seem statistically valid and you're like, I don't know what's happening. But that's okay. Just take the survey if you want. goodenoughnow.com/survey. What is important to remember is that we are all capable of doing really good things and we are all really annoying. So I invite you to Martin Luther King. So when I was talking earlier about the heart action folks, which I think on the first call, Andy, I may have automatically diagnosed you as this, but a heart action person usually is dependent on people scurrying behind them to do the things. They're usually very charismatic, but they don't necessarily worry or are concerned with like budgets or bandwidth or time frames or gravity or something. They really just kind of have great ideas. Like that's what they do. So what's fascinating is that this is also what is really annoying about them, because sometimes out of habit they can be micromanagey, but sometimes they can also be micromanagey without really a solid through line. So then it's kind of like hit or miss micromanagey, which is exactly what happened with Martin Luther King. The irony here is the I Have a Dream part of the speech was a 45-minute riff off script and over 3 other people's spots. And that's the part of the speech that most of us remember. Very dependent on other people, appreciative of other people, but also can be really challenged, right? So regularly showing up as a heart action person. Martin Luther King, as an example, had a PhD and was an ordained minister before he was 40. Tapping into those kind of systems were really, really helpful in being able to navigate Martin Luther King's desire to do some kind of good work. That was how he became unstoppable. Okay, so can be annoying, can also do really great work. All of these things are true. Politically speaking, I know this is a nonpartisan organization, but I said this in the first call. This is also a great example of both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Both of them have really great ideas. not so forthcoming on the policies or the rollout of how any of those ideas are actually going to happen. But man, people buy the t-shirts like they're hotcakes. Great. Next up is Mother Teresa. I married one of these. I think, Kellen, I think this goes to the paralysis piece of the conversation that we are having. Mother Teresa is a really great example of a head heart person. So they kind of gather all of the information and seem to others to be very, very, very slow to make a decision or act. And others perceive that as paralysis. Sometimes this person perceives it as just not having enough information and not being sure what to do. Because action is the third variable, when they do actually act, they often don't regret any decisions they make. My action variable is so high, I regret pretty much every decision I've ever made. I still question what I did with my parents' yearbooks when they died in 1993. I'm not sure if I donated them or if I recycled them or if I gave them to an artist. I don't know. Fun facts, can't undo it. But I certainly did something quickly, and now I don't know if I approve of that. Whereas Mother Teresa can gather all the information, she doesn't have answers. She is stuck in spin cycle. So for if you read her journals and works, and all my master's work on my thesis was all archival research of these three folks. So what's fascinating about her is that she questioned the will of God. Was it the will of God to have suffering, or was it the will of God for her to intervene? And because she didn't know the answer, her decisions may seem very inconsistent. So sometimes she did these kind of things, and sometimes she withheld pain medication. In her own work, she eventually realized that she had access to building a school. So she was able to tap into that action place, show up in a relatively unstoppable way. And at least in comparison, wasn't assassinated, right? Like, she died of natural causes. At least that's what the conspiracy theorists say. So there's some positives here that can also be incredibly frustrating to work with when people are looking for actual leadership. But it's also when people are really talking about what they believe, how they act, what do they think, why do they think this? This is the kind of person who's going to kind of be a maven and collect all of that information. And sometimes it's really hard to just instantaneously know what to do. When I think about like all the organizations putting out statements right now for Black Lives Matter, what is fascinating to me is some of the organizations have just put something out really quickly because it was such an urgent need, and then somebody eventually spell checked that, and then they had to come back and do it again, and then they had to do like a second one. Well, now it looks bad that you had to like say Black Lives Matter in two different ways because you didn't even get it right the first way because you forgot to send it to legal, right? Like, this is where high action people can get kind of wrapped around the axle. Someone who is drafting a statement which takes into account all of the things that need to be taken into account for and then eventually put out might be a better statement, but it was way slow. So then you'll end up putting out a statement like, yeah, thanks. Now it just looks like you're doing it because everybody else is doing it. Does this make sense? So last but not least is the head action people. So I am of this team. So what is fascinating to remember about us is that first off, all three archetypes are annoying to somebody. So as a head action person, I think what's important is that I don't play well with others. I am self-employed. I have 0 employees. I am my own boss. I am constantly writing letters of insubordination to myself that I then receive and immediately rip up in defiance and say, fine, I will quit. And then I beg myself to work again. That is a weird ego loop that you can get trapped in. When I mentioned micromanagement earlier, the micromanagement without kind of like a path, right, to kind of hit or miss as to what's happening is usually coming from feelings of not necessarily knowing exactly the right way of doing things. So I would imagine trying to navigate what is morally correct and what is nonpartisan is a great example of like, whereas a head action person would be like, you know what? Just let me do it, right? Because I don't trust anybody else to do anything else. Or I'm going to have all these people do everything else, but I'm going to be up in everybody's nostrils, making sure that they're all doing it my way, which is not helpful, right? And so, I mean, it can really be harmful to a team. So when I see this in organizations, and I'm not calling y'all out, I don't know anything about y'all's organization, but when I see this in organizations, what I find is that the lack of trust is now perceived as miscommunication. And miscommunication is actually perceived as a lack of trust. So I have to squeegee that stuff off so that we can actually get to like, what are we going to do? These particular folks, and Gandhi specifically, really very, very, very bad students. This is not about being smart. This is not about being like an excellent academic as much as it is just kind of going through the motions, looking for why does it matter. So when Gandhi stumbled into compassion and realized that his work would impact 7 generations out, that is when he became unstoppable. But prior to then, really was kind of apathetic and bumbling along and not really knowing what was going to happen. He's a first generation college student that almost flunked out. He's pretty convinced that he got into law school in an administrative error. Lawyers asked him to stop practicing law because he was so terrible in the court cases. So he went to South Africa, and while he was there, he kind of bumbled around and eventually kind of sort of found the idea of justice and nonviolent civil disobedience, and then from there was able to actually align with all 3 variables. That is an annoying person to work with, and did good stuff, right? I like to remind myself that Gandhi was not just assassinated, but assassinated by his own people, like from the inside, because that's when you know you're annoying. So keep that mindful, keep it mindful. So you more than likely fit into one of these characters. So if that's like an ego boost because of all the amazing work that you are doing and that you are capable of doing, great. Please also notice that you are also hella annoying to somebody. And so what are you going to do about how you are really annoying? Really good teams take the 3 strongest archetypes and make a good decision from that place. And I can usually tell that I'm going to do this and it's going to work because they're sitting in a room like, why are you having me work with this person? Why? They normally aren't collaborators together because that's not how systems are designed. Systems are designed to stay in place. And when you pull together 3 people with 3 very different response patterns, you're probably going to do something that's going to shift the internal culture or the system within that culture. So that is pretty much the basis of most of my research, because I think the thing we are most responsible for is becoming conscious of the unconscious. And we have to do that on an individual level, and we have to do that as an organization and as a group. Literally the organization, but also individually as a human being and the groups that our human being belong to. That's where I get really fired up about my work. So now what? How do we change the world? Just a little shout out reminder that this is not a linear process, and that as soon as you start doing stuff and you actually start making some progress, something will happen. The system will change, the definitions will change, the known variables will change, and it will move from there. Another period of conversations that I've been having this, or theme of conversations I've been having this weekend, is have we gotten better? I'm using air quotes. Or have we gotten worse, or has it stayed the same? And the answer is yes. What are you talking about? Right? Like, yes, it is true that things have gotten better in this level and this level, and worse in this level and this level, and have roughly stayed the same, and you are now noticing, but you will soon forget because who knows what disaster is coming next in 2020. So how do we stay actively engaged in the cycle so that we can actually be making some progress to the unconscious infrastructure of a system? And in this case, if we're talking about what's up in the news right now, we could be talking about the system of racism and white supremacy in the United States. But we still on the table is water and Flint, voters suppression. Do we need an electoral college? What about immigration, refugees? How are we feeling? Is it really America first? Because if that's the case, can we look at how we treat like houseless, homeless, veterans, things like within inside of the United States? Because we have a lot of work to do there. But it is convenient to say like shut down, let's focus here first, except no one's doing that either. What do we do? That is a conversation that really fundamentally gets to how are we being responsible for who and how we are showing up in the world. And it might start as easy as optical illusions, or to conversations that you have with people that you actually feel successful at having a conversation with. All of the things need to happen, and they happen on repeat. It's also important to remember this is not the time for perfection. Some of you may remember this little meme that went around Facebook, and it was beautiful and wonderful, and everyone I know printed it out and put it up in their offices, and it was really great. And my favorite part is it has a typo in it. This, by the way, is a perfect example of being a head action person, is that I saw this and was like, why does it have a typo in it? And just buzz killed everybody who thought it was beautiful. I actually have decided I like that it has a typo in it, because why not? It's still beautiful, and it's still a beautiful concept. So now, can we have the conversations to inform our actions, to take a beautiful poster image with a typo in it and actually turn them into how we are living our lives and how we are treating other people? Can we just get to that part, typo or not? That'd be great. So head, heart, and action, I believe, is a way, or at least a gateway to having a conversation across people's pain without causing more pain, without tokenizing someone who's had an experience who then has to go teach about that particular thing. Being able to know that we are all equally frustrating and annoying and really able to do great work and great harm at the exact same time that you're conscious or unconscious of is where the conversation has to pause. Because I want to set that in, not to the answer of duck bunny or what kind of optical illusions you saw, but how can I, how can you, how can we become more conscious of what we are unconscious of? How can we become more conscious of what we are unconscious of that's positive? How can we become more conscious of what we are unconscious of that is negative? If we just had a conversation about unconscious bias, it would automatically be how dominant identities are treating subordinated identities in a negative way. And I don't think that's dismantling the story that we have written that's created the systems of oppression that we are navigating right now. I don't think it's only that. I think we have to understand that we must become more conscious of what we are unconscious of. So then once we know what we are working with, then, like I said last time, we can keep what we need to keep because it makes us feel safe and prepared, even if we're wrong. But now we know we're wrong, and this makes us feel safe and prepared. This, wow, that's wildly incongruent with who I want to be. I'm going to fix this piece. And then there's the stuff in the middle that's kind of case by case basis. I think it's funny that the first time I went to an Indigo Girls concert, of course, we're standing in line for the bathroom, and we're all in line for the women's bathroom, and there's millions and millions of people, not really millions, but lots of people standing in line for the bathroom. They made jokes about it after intermission. So while we're standing in line, there's all these political organizations with their clipboards, right? Smart, because we're all standing in line for the bathroom. So I'm signing this, and I'm signing this one, I'm signing this one, and then finally there was one. P.S. I think FedEx is here. I told you this was going to happen. I'm signing all the little petitions, and then finally there was one that was against the death penalty. And I was like, oh, I'm not against the death penalty. And in the lobby to the bathroom, it was like, what is wrong with you? And I'm like, I didn't know this was like a Scantron test that you had to like fill in everything exactly the right way. Like, sorry, I don't know that I'm against the death penalty. It became a thing. I wasn't even allowed to go to the bathroom. Okay, so then fast forward years. One, I learned more about the death penalty and kind of had an opinion, kind of didn't really have an opinion. I don't really know that I knew what I thought about the death penalty at that point, because it wasn't something that had impacted my life directly. It wasn't something that someone I knew directly had been impacted. Okay, great. Fast forward well into adulthood. What ended up happening is a really good friend of mine was murdered by the equivalent of who she thought was her baby daddy. This was horrible. It was in Texas. It made CNN. Nancy Grace did this whole big story about it. I was the last phone call that she made, so I got called into a murder trial in Texas, which is a very strange way to get called back into Texas. And I'm sitting in the trial, and it was gruesome and awful and horrible and all of this stuff. And I go to the bathroom. Notice, full circle. So I get out of the stall, and I'm washing my hands. Woman comes out of the next stall, is washing her hands, and it is the mother of the guy who pled guilty for the murder. And I'm sitting there and I'm realizing in that moment, washing my hands, yellow tile, I'm realizing that nothing that is going to happen right now is going to bring back any of her sons. So her eldest son died in the first Desert Storm. Second son committed suicide, and this is her third son. And the death penalty is not going to solve any of the grief in her life. And honestly, it's not going to solve any of the grief in my life or anyone related to Lisa or her 7-year-old son or her unborn child, or it's not going to solve anything. And it's not obviously a deterrent. And there, in the moment, washing my hands next to someone who is the mother of someone who is now has been electrocuted, that is the moment that I no longer supported the death penalty. But it wasn't signing a clipboard at the Indigo Girls. But I'm responsible for noticing the time and the arc and like the self-absorbed nature of as soon as the death penalty had a personal impact on me, I had to form an opinion. Now I'm sharing that with you not to get some kind of like kudo points or not kudo points. I don't know your stance on the death penalty. But what I'm sharing you with is that I had to get conscious of what I was unconscious of. And then I had to make a determination once I got conscious of what I was unconscious of is how am I going to move forward with this? And I think being open and honest about that, what seemed like a very big struggle to me, is a step. So is writing a check, so is forwarding something on Facebook, so is actually leaving your house and marching in the streets, so is writing policy, so is caring for people, so is pitching bail, so is helping someone get tear gas out of their eyes. All of these things are needed, and we're available at different times in different ways, in different manners, but we have to be conscious and responsible of what we are conscious and unconscious of. If we can understand that, now we can move into what it actually would mean to be a better ally or to be an advocate, or what does this mean for diversity and social justice. But if we don't understand who we are and how we are, and we don't understand what we're conscious and unconscious of when we are being ourselves, we can't begin to have that conversation. So in theory, that's part 3. That's where we're headed. In the time that we have left, I want to kind of pause there because I know that I'm showering you with a bunch of information. I want to check in and see how are we doing? How are we thinking? How are we feeling? What is coming up for you before I give you kind of your homework and we prepare for the next assignment. It's not really homework. It's a handout you have to look at. Don't panic. So how are you doing? I have a thumbs up. Oh, Brittany, I think we forgot to make you co-host. I think you were talking, but I don't know if you were talking to me or not. Not talking to me. Great. Okay. Okay, now everybody, people kind of were coming and going. I don't know if that was internet or life. Doesn't matter. So now you're all co-host again. So you should be able to mute and unmute. Thoughts, comments? This is the audience participation part. Let's see if I got any text. The texting number. Yes, go ahead.
Kevin asked a question, and I was intrigued in it because I've never taken the test that she mentioned, but I'm interested in it because I would like to know about your test also to see. You know, I'm like, I'm all 3, but like really, I'm sure I'm more one or the other. So, would you mind answering her in the chat?
I just saw this. Thank you very much. I have used the Harvard implicit bias test. Interested that you don't reference it as an option. Do you think it isn't a good test or not as good? I learned a lot from it, but I didn't give action items to deal with results, which I appreciate this training in doing. First off, thank you. So I'm familiar with the Harvard implicit bias test. I have no problem with it. Sounds great. Knock yourself out. I have found in when I was doing research for my book that some of these tests are not wildly accessible and available. Sometimes they come at a cost, or sometimes you have to have an access, etc. And as I was pulling together implicit bias tests, but also like DISC and Myers-Briggs and other personality related things, like of course I'm certified in all of those things because I'm like a certification junkie, because that is what head action people do, is we just gather the things that look how good I am. even though I actually feel horrible. That's the hard part. Anyway, so in doing all of those, I wanted to create something that was accessible, for lack of better words, appears to be lighthearted, so that I could engage more folks into the conversation, but that I could also use across the board for people who have never in their entire life had these conversations, and folks that their job or their organization is having these conversations. So I eventually just kind of created my own. But I'm certainly not saying that it's not relevant or not possible. I think it's great. Um, I also think that if we can have a conversation about implicit bias in day-to-day conversations with our coworkers or our family members, with people who are exactly like us, then the skills can be more, I'm using these words very strategically, but those skills can be sharp and comfortable to then have a conversation across difference. Because it's the same skills, it's not anything different, but we think it is because we're not as comfortable with it. But discomfort does not mean different. Discomfort just means discomfort. But no, I think it's great. So, and then Katrina, to your point, the survey, it really does involve questions about taco trucks and Dolly Parton. So this is not like an intense grab a beverage kind of drink or test. You could probably do it while watching something on Netflix. And the survey again is goodenoughnow.com/survey. And you're welcome to fill that out. And it's just how you're responding to those particular questions. And when I'm in person and I have people do it in advance, I start off with, so what'd you think of the survey? And what is hysterical to me is the head action person, people are like, well, I think it was actually really dumb, because, but they don't know how to say that because they're like, heaven forbid they be offensive. So they just say like, well, I mean, I didn't know how to answer it. Like if you meant at work or at home, or like, well, what about this information? And how about this? Like, it just seemed like, I don't know what to like. Yes. So welcome to the head action team, right? Or head heart team. When I am live in a group, I will describe these probably even shorter than I did in this particular webinar. And if your action is high, you like instantly pick a team, which I think is hysterical because we also do this with Laurel and Yanny and gold dress or blue dress, right? Like, nope, this is my team. That's my team. I'm right. And the people who where action is a little lower are like, well, I don't know. She just mentioned this model. Like, is there a handout? Like, I don't know. How am I supposed to know this very important information? Like that in itself is telling in a group. So then we can have more of a conversation, right? Plus head heart people's how I sell books. Because they need more information. I can't get, what is happening? I can't get my little file thing to work. Why are you not working? I don't understand. Anyway, I can't get my little file thing to give you the homework assignment. Is a flow chart that I also, and tap in, you will notice there's lots of things out there that are very similar to this. When I was, I didn't know that I was writing a book, if that makes any sense, but when I was trying to cure my own burnout, I read, they're right here, Crucial, Difficult, Fierce, and Courageous Conversations. And all of those books were great and had a lot to offer me while I was trying to cure my burnout. And my impression is a lot of the book, the last third, is kind of like, I felt like, hurry up, your deadline's coming. So it's like all this stuff about clearer communication across difficult topics or difficult people. And then at the end, it's like, and that's how you get your car for cheaper, right? Like, ooh, it just didn't land right. And so then that ended up being kind of the launch pad for like, okay, I think I have to like I think I have something to say here that I was noticing and observing from my different audiences, etc. And then the flow chart that for some reason I can't seem to upload today, but I will email it out with the recording. But the flow chart that I came up with is better connections. And the idea is that you are choosing to make a better connection with this person that you are about to engage with. You're choosing to. Now that's step one, right? So if you're not interested in choosing and making a better connection, flowchart stops there. But if you have decided that this is where you're going to make a better connection, then the next step is that you're actually going to try to like engage with this person. That's the second step. The third step is you're not going to say anything yet. You're going to listen and observe where they are and what's going on. Then you're going to form your message that's appropriate to where you have observed or perceived them to be. Then you're going to take responsibility after delivering that message. Did that work out? Like, did you have the intention that you meant? And then you're going to take responsibility for it, even if they don't call you out or say, what the hell did you say that for? You know if it did or didn't work if you're paying attention some of the time. Great. Then once you take responsibility for it, how did that impact your relationship? If it worked well, it probably made your relationship even better. Great. If it didn't work out well, it could make your relationship better. It could make your relationship worse. You don't know, but you're responsible for it. And then what are you going to do next time? And then the cycle starts over. The reason why I love this chart so much is that it takes stranger conversations that you're never going to see the person again. It takes intimate relationships, like, okay, we're going to dive into this topic, we're going to do this. I have found great success when working within industries that have a protocol of how they are supposed to engage with someone. So whether that is medical, law enforcement, the military, etc., there's very strict things that they're supposed to say and do. I always make this joke when I say medical, police, and military, and the gap, because the gap has those weird, like, must be addressed within 5 seconds of entering the door things. We have these like mandated customer service things that we do that feel very disingenuous and inauthentic, because they are. Which is why when you're rolling around a grocery store, the same clerk could welcome you more than once, because they just see a person, they're not seeing you. And there's a difference there, right? So I have found it to be really helpful and kind of like slowing your roll occasionally into having one of those conversations. So I'll hand the flow chart out. Cool. Other thoughts or comments?
I took the test just while we were doing it, and I got action, and it made me chuckle because it says, I bet you're doing something else while taking the quiz. And I am that person that's always like multitasking. I thought I would have been ahead, but I got action, which in it makes complete sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, and remember, all three variables are in all of us. So I kind of am, I'm used to using the tool. So even just listening to you, like, I thought I would score this way, but it turned this way. So I will validate that result. That's a pretty head action response, even though it said you're just action, which is fine. Welcome to the team. We're right. No one else knows, but it's fine. Yeah, and you can take it multiple times, because depending on the context you're in, you might show up in a different way. Tappan, you might be interested in this, but it's interesting to say that I don't have any time, because it seems like I should have a lot of time. But the next book, I think, is going to have something to do with how emotional intelligence impacts your ability to have conversation across type. My parents were not divorced, and so I don't know this other than just from experience of listening to other people. But if you navigated like holidays in multiple different houses for divorce or some other reason, your emotional intelligence is probably way higher than mine, because you've had to, like, oh my God, what's happening here? Okay, well, now I'm going to shift and adjust this way. Same thing, same skills are required with shifting and covering at work when we move into like what is professional and what isn't professional, and how do you talk to your real friends versus your coworker friends. And a lot of those things are being broken down now because of sheltering in place. But I think that my hypothesis is that there is an interesting engagement, and I haven't quite figured out the model for it yet, but between emotional intelligence and manifesting toxicity. Because if you're really good at managing people, you're really good at managing toxicity as well. And when do you choose to use your skills for good and skills for bad? So that is hopefully the next book. Wish me luck.
That all ties into empathy too. Like, it's like a baseline, right? You start off as someone who's very empathetic, and then you can manage, but you also take it in at the same time. It's hard to separate the two.
Yeah. And I would also just add where the toxicity piece comes in is that you can weaponize what you've taken in as well.
Exactly. Yeah, that's fascinating. I look forward to the second book. That sounds fun.
So, like, what's interesting is the more I read about the Amy Cooper situation in Central Park, like, what I believe is happening consciously or unconsciously in the Amy Cooper in that particular moment is exactly the intersection of emotional intelligence and toxicity, and the weaponizing of those identities and what that really means. The reason being is there's a history of her like amping up a response when she is defensive. And so if amping up a response when she is defensive, first off, this is not a loan to Amy Cooper. It's just an example in the news, right? But like, why do you know that that works? Or why do you know that that's your conscious or unconscious? Why is that your go-to move when challenged? And what variables around you are you emotionally intelligent enough to pick up, right? Like, let's pretend I was the birder in Central Park and I said, put your damn dog on a leash. Which, for the record, that person did not even cuss, but that's exactly how I would say it, because put your damn dog on a leash is pretty much what I say every time I go outside the house. So I would have dog treats in my pocket because that works too, because owners don't like you feeding their dogs, so they'll actually pull their dog back then. I am on the same page with Mr. Cooper, absolutely. However, Amy would not have escalated that with the police if I had been the person telling her or yelling her or asking her in this case to put her dog on a leash, right? It takes emotional intelligence to play plinko with what variables are present, right? What does that mean? And then how does toxicity, anyway, I'm now selling a book I haven't written yet. Great. So fun facts. Okay, it's 9:31 on the dot, at least here on the West Coast. I can hang out, y'all can leave. I will buffer said video and email it out as quickly as possible with said handout. Look, I'm writing it down, handout, so I don't forget. Thank you for playing the rename game. If you have any thoughts or comments or questions or anything that I can help with, please feel free. Again, the texting number is 202-670-4262. I ain't kidding. Send me a text message, however I can help. But as you're processing and thinking about things, like, I don't want you to feel like you have to do that alone, but I also don't want you to feel like you have to, my language, burden someone you work with because they may or may not be your go-to person to have these conversations. Like, they're dealing with their own shit right now. You're paying me, so use me. So whatever I can do, happy to help.
Yes, can I ask you to say something you said last week one more time? It was 3 steps, like you went through each of your sort of things, and it was 3 steps for identifying something, like recognizing your privilege, and then there was like 2 more steps underneath it, and I got the gist, but I didn't get your language for each of them. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't.
Maybe not.
I might have said it because I thought of it in the moment. Sometimes I can be very articulate.
It was just like, it was like pulling it together in a very concise way. I'll go back and watch the video at some point.
Sure. Yeah. Do that, but then let me know too what it is that stuck and resonated, because sometimes I really do say things once and I don't know that I said it. And if it resonated, then
it like deserved its own slide, I think. I will find it. So.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. My KitchenAid has been picked up and I believe the mail has been dropped off. So may everyone have a decent Monday. For those of you that are already halfway through it, Tuesday's coming. So thank you very much, y'all.
Thanks, Jess.
Very welcome.
Thank you, Jess.
More than welcome. Bye. Hi, friend. How are you doing?